Alright, what's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Stonks Maxxing. So, I have about an hour to do some research on these tariffs. Basically, Trump announced 3 hours ago in his post game press conference at Rose Garden there's going to be 10% blanket tariffs, I believe, on all countries. And that is the bar right now. That's the ceiling, according to Scott Bessent. And then also reciprocal tariffs on different countries: China, Taiwan, Thailand, Malaysia, European Union, which I guess is a trade bloc. So whatever European Union says, the countries need to do. But let's get into this. Okay, so I just realized that I want to make sure. Okay, it's good. So this is the Discord. Okay, let's go here first. So let's do ZF1 economics. So let's see if we can get some recaps. All right, tariff. I bet that's probably pretty big. WSJ. %, baseline tariffs. So Scott Bessent. Maybe I'm not spelling his name right. Okay. From his Bloomberg interview, it sounded like Scott Bessent claimed this is the ceiling, doesn't want other countries to panic, and is willing to negotiate. Across the board, on all imports, effective April 5th. So today's Wednesday, I guess. Tomorrow will be 3rd. So that'll be Saturday. Saturday. New 34% tariff on China will be added to previous duties. Okay, so going back to, I think, what it opened today at. Oh wait, these are E-minis, never mind. Oh God. Oh, I just realized that. Yeah, that could be interesting. I hopefully it doesn't lead to any big problems. Yeah, I wonder if these tariffs are sort of unfairly, like a 10% blanket tariff. Is that unfair to other industries where maybe foreign investment isn't that big of a problem? But I guess then again, maybe the tariffs themselves won't have too much of an effect. Okay, so 10% baseline tariffs across the board on all imports effective April 5th. Reciprocal, oh God, I can't spell. Okay, so RECI tariffs on select countries. So China, EU, call them trade blocs. Thailand, Malaysia, Taiwan. So shaky ground forward. country. Okay, let's take a look. Oh, here we go. Taiwan, 32%, India, 26%, Japan, so 24%. All right, I guess be helpful to create a little Excel workbook. Close economics. So country, so China, Vietnam, Taiwan, EU, India, Japan. So tariff, Liberation Day. On Taiwan, 20%, 26%, 24%. Dude, this is gonna crush. I feel like I own a lot of VFC stock. Yeah, it's down 5%. Shit, dude. Was that $14 earlier? It's not good. Yeah, Nike's also down. Damn, dude. $60. Canada, Mexico. None. What is in lieu of? Does this mean addition? Okay, so I guess it is really 10% plus 14%. $34%. Fentanyl. So 25%. Yeah. Guess the total tariffs will be this then. %, tariffs. Okay. So auto tariffs 25%. So blanket tariffs 10%. Okay, yeah, so that's the Bloomberg. I do actually want to run it back one more time because you did talk a little bit about the tax policies. Oh, what's good, Andre? What's up? What's up? Okay, let's go, Scott.
When I started Walton Goggins Goggle Glasses, I had no idea what I was doing. But GoDaddy Aero does, using AI to build a logo, website, and social content.
We're going to have the baseline tariffs come into effect first, then there are reciprocal tariffs, a little bit more of a different rate for each individual trading partner. Are you preparing to negotiate with some of these trading partners before that tariff rate comes into effect on April 9th?
Well, I think there have been a lot of discussions, but I think we're just going to have to wait and see what would happen. What I would say, Anne-Marie, is I would advise none of the countries to panic. I wouldn't try to retaliate, because as long as you don't retaliate, this is the high end of the number. And I think...
Okay, so...
As long as you don't retaliate.
As long as you don't retaliate.
This is the high end of the number, and I think the market could have certainty that this is the number barring retaliation. So we've got a ceiling, and then we can see if there's a different floor.
So you sound like you're ready for negotiation with a number of these partners. Has the European Union, has China, has India, have these countries reached out?
Well, they've all reached out, but it's going to be up to President Trump to see what he wants to do. I think the mindset might be to let things settle for a while. Their tariffs or non-tariff barriers have been on a long time, so we'll see where it goes from here.
When it comes to China, they have a much higher rate on this list. On top of that, there's still that 20% fentanyl tariff rate. Is all of this coming together to be more than a 50% tariff rate for Beijing?
Well, yes, I think it is, and I think it's a combination of things. And, again, that I think China said today that solving the fentanyl crisis depends on taking off the fentanyl tariffs, and I'm pretty sure that's not the way the sequencing is going to work. They're exporting the precursor chemicals, and every day, every week, every month, Americans are dying, and it's going to have to stop.
When it comes to places like China, the president has mentioned he's willing to even look at things like TikTok to potentially do a negotiation with them when it comes to tariffs. I'm sure you're looking at things like the yuan. What's on the table when it comes to this trade realignment between Beijing and Washington?
Well, we haven't started anything yet. We've been busy with the tariffs. I've been busy, as we talked about earlier. The tax bill's going very well. So I think that we will move toward the bilateral relationship with China now that we've done the multilateral tariffs.
Okay. Move towards bilateral relationships with China. your multilateral stuff is done. So this is the reciprocal tariff. Oh, man, I keep spelling this wrong. Reciprocal tariff.
Plans for conversations or a trip to Beijing?
Nothing imminent.
When it comes to this negotiation, April 9th, these tariffs come in place. Do you plan on having negotiations before that date?
Again, I'm not part of the negotiations, so we'll see. I am sure that there are going to be a lot of calls. I just don't know if they're going to be negotiations.
The president had this huge chart showing all of the different rates. Canada and Mexico notably missing on that chart. Why is that?
I'm not sure.
Not sure. Okay, I imagine that has to do potentially because they're already in negotiations previously with the 25%. I'm not sure if you saw the initial market reaction.
I haven't.
So, equity futures slid on the news. You had talked about how we're in a detox period. Do you feel that we're still in that period, or are you starting to get a little bit concerned?
Well, the detox period has nothing to do with the tariffs. The detox period is off this incredible level of government spending.
Okay, so detox period has nothing to do with tariffs. Oops. Has to do with government spending.
We've had an unsustainable amount of fiscal stimulus, and look, that's got to stop. That's got to stop. So, can we continue weaning ourselves off of that? And as we see private or public sector borrowing go down, private sector borrowing go up, public sector jobs come down, private sector jobs go up. Is it going to be perfectly symmetrical? No, but we did.
Okay, so wants to see public sector borrowing go down, private sector borrowing go up, wants to see public sector employment go down, private sector employment go up.
See an increase of 10,000 manufacturing jobs last month.
So does
But we did see an increase of 10,000 manufacturing jobs last month.
So it doesn't concern you today that during the tariff announcement, equity futures sold off when initially they were rallying when the president only announced a 10% tariff base, and then they fell when he announced the higher rates for things like the European.
Okay.
1,000 manufacturing jobs last month.
So it doesn't concern you today that during the tariff announcement, equity futures sold off when initially they were rallying when the president only announced a 10% tariff base, and then they fell when he announced the higher rates for things like the European Union and China.
Yeah, and Anne Marie, I've learned not to look what goes on in after-hours markets.
Okay, but since the peaks in February, stocks are down 8%. I think the NASDAQ from its high most recently is down 12%. So far, though, this kind of market downdraft so far this year is not concerning you?
Well, look, in my old business, I was very concerned about market movements, and I'm trying to be Secretary of Treasury, not a market commentator. What I would point out is that especially the NASDAQ peaked on Deep Seek Day.
Does this sound familiar? You read about the cursor hype on Twitter, went to give it a try.
So that's a Mag 7 problem, not a MAGA problem.
Okay, so let's talk about what else you've been spending a lot of your time doing. You have been up on Capitol Hill constantly. You are really working on trying to make sure that this administration can extend the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. On top of that, more tax cuts. Right now, how are the conversations going in Congress?
Well, I actually think the most underreported story in Washington, not by Bloomberg, of course, is the incredible unity amongst Republicans. And I think it's President Trump's leadership, but Mike Johnson, with a very narrow margin, issued the reconciliation instructions, and then he also passed a clean continuing resolution. On the Senate side, they are very attentive, and I think they may have something done by this Saturday.
This Saturday. Okay, that's the start of it, though.
Yeah, that's the start.
You recently talked about how you think it's not just going to be tax on tips. No tax on tips. That gets added to this.
Reconciliate Republicans, and I think it's President Trump's leadership, but Mike Johnson, with a very narrow margin, issued the reconciliation instructions, and then he also passed a clean continuing resolution. And then he also passed a clean continuing resolution. On the Senate side, they are very attentive, and I think they may have something done by this Saturday.
This Saturday. Okay, that's the start of it, though.
Yeah, that's the start.
You recently talked about how you think it's not just going to be tax on tips. No tax on tips. That gets added to this bill. You think reconciliation can include a plethora of what the president has talked about. No tax on tips, no tax on Social Security. Also recently talking about rebates if you buy an American car. How do you get all of this done?
The deductibility of interest if you buy an American car, which I'm older than you are, but when I bought my first car, the interest was deductible, but now it's got to be only on American cars.
So how do you do all this at the same time that market participants, fiscal hawks, budget hawks in Congress are concerned about the deficit? How are you going to have this big reconciliation package?
Well, I think, as we've seen, there's a lot of room to cut spending. So I think, again, where Republicans have incredible unity is on the spending cuts, as we're seeing.
So when it comes to the timeline of all of this, I do notice that now reconciliation, it seems to be an agreement between the House and the Senate that they're willing to consider about raising the debt ceiling. Mm-hmm. So do you plan on getting this bill done before the X date, which the CBO is saying could be the middle of the summer or September?
Well, Anne-Marie, I think you just answered the question for yourself, because if debt ceiling is solved via reconciliation, then it has to be done before we hit the X date. And we're going to go on to the warning track sometime in May or June.
So that's when you plan to get this tax bill done?
That's a goal.
So if we could put both these stories together today, the president comes out with tariffs, you're working on the tax plan. He talks about tariffs being revenue raisers to offset the tax bill you're working on. At the same time, you and the president also talk about a negotiation you're willing to do to get reciprocity when it comes to other trading partners. How can it be both revenue raising and a negotiation?
Well, to the extent that the tariffs are higher than what we had, it will raise revenues. And, as far as the negotiations, we'll see. And, I could tell you, though, it's not going to be possible to include the tariffs in the CBO scoring. So that will be something running in the background. And as the president said, we've taken in several $100 billion on the China tariffs, but those don't get scored.
Do you feel that you need to have enough revenue raised from these tariffs before this reconciliation package comes to play in Congress?
Well, I don't think we have to have the revenues raised. And look, we're doing two things. Tariffs are going to raise revenues, and then we're also stamping out waste, fraud, and abuse in the government and bringing down the expenses and spending. And we're not going to get credit for either of those with the CBO scoring. So when your audience, when American people see these CBO scores, there could be large, but there is a substantial amount of tariff income. There's a substantial amount of savings.
While all this is happening, consumer sentiment has definitely taken a bit of a dive. Expectations for inflation have gone up. Banks like Goldman are cutting their GDP forecast, saying potentially the Fed is going to have to cut rates, not the good kind of cuts, the kind of cuts because they're nervous about growth. How concerned are you that the timing of all this is going to be incredibly challenging because of how the American consumer, how corporate America is feeling at this moment?
Well, it tells me a couple of things. One, we got to get the tax bill done quickly, because that's a confidence builder. And two, we're seeing sentiment surveys from the American people, but we haven't actually seen them take action. If the households actually thought that there were going to be inflation, if their real inflation expectations had increased, what would they be doing? They'd be hoarding goods, and they would be demanding wage increases, and neither one of those has happened yet.
So at the moment, you're not concerned about some of the soft data we're seeing?
No, I see nothing, and one of the great things, many great things about being a Treasury is we have lots of business people come through, and everything we're seeing in the economy is still very solid.
And executives haven't voiced any of these concerns onto you?
No, there's some idiosyncratic things, but in terms of the expectations actually turning into hard data, none of them have seen it yet.
Now that you're working on the tax bill, and of course,
Okay, so no one has seen sour expectations turn into hard data yet. To the consumer spending of the economy.
of course, tariffs at the moment are out of the way. What else is on the agenda for you for the rest of the year?
Well, we have the Ukraine deal that's coming up. We've gone to maximum pressure on Iran, so a big part of Treasury is national security. And then we are doing a big push on deregulating in a smart, safe, and sound way the regulated financial institutions, which is going to allow for the private sector, not the government sector, to grow.
When it comes to international, where are you with Iran, Ukraine and the mineral deal?
I believe we may have a team from Ukraine coming over as soon as the end of this week or the beginning of next week. Ukrainians have, I believe that they've hired counsel. And what we did was after the incident in the White House on, I believe it was February 28th, we were going to sign a 4-page deal that was parameters of understanding. And at Treasury, we took the opportunity to move forward to the big deal. So this is the exact same deal that would have resulted from the 4-page signature deal. So we've just fast forwarded, and we didn't want to lose any time because we believe this deal is so important for the American people, for the Ukrainian people, and for the peace process.
So it sounds like in the next 2 weeks you're going to have this deal over the finish line.
It's ready on our side.
When it comes to Iran, since you mentioned that, and I know you're going to be focused a lot on international aspects, now the tariffs are done and you have the tax deals underway. When it comes to Iran, do you think we could see secondary tariffs, secondary sanctions?
Well, we've already seen sanctions for the first time. U.S. Treasury sanctioned a so-called teapot refinery, which is a private sector refinery in China, and they are the buyers of the Iranian oil, and we could see more of that.
Wow, interesting. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, you've been very generous with your time today. We really appreciate it here at Bloomberg TV. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah, good reporting. Good Q&A. Okay. I guess it'll be interesting to get some commentary. Yeah, I have to admit, this thumbnail is very clickbaity. Okay.
Can you please just hear me out? No, all work management platforms are the same. They take forever to learn, and in the end, nobody...
Je vais commencer quelques mots. So, President Trump has just announced a series of measures that are going to fundamentally change the international trading system. Now, in doing so, he has preserved a number of important elements of our relationship, the commercial relationship between Canada and the United States. But the fentanyl tariffs still remain in place, as do the tariffs for steel and aluminum. As of this evening, the tariffs on automobiles will enter into force, and the U.S. has signaled that there will be additional tariffs in so-called strategic sectors, pharmaceuticals, lumber, and semiconductors. So we're in a situation where
Global foundries.
there's going to be an impact on the U.S. economy, which will build with time. In our judgment, it will be negative on the U.S. economy. That will have an impact on us. But the series of measures will directly affect millions of Canadians.
Yeah, it's not good.
We are going to fight these tariffs with countermeasures. We are going to protect our workers, and we are going to build the strongest economy in the G7. In a crisis, it's important to come together, and it's essential to act with purpose and with force. And that's what we will do. Alors, en français, si je peux. Monsieur le Président Trump, ils viennent d'annoncer une série de mesures qui seront changées le système du commerce international dans une manière fondamentale. On fait cela. Il a préservé quelques grands aspects de les relations canado-américaines, très importants. Mais en même temps, les tarifs injustifiés contre l'acier et l'aluminium restent en place. Et ce soir, les tarifs dans le secteur automobile, lutter contre ce tarif, nous nous battons contre les tarifs américains. Nous protégeons le territoire. Committee, Canada-US Cabinet Committee, tomorrow morning, il y aura une réponse canadienne. So I've just had a meeting of my Canada-US Council. I will shortly have a meeting, we will have a meeting of the Cabinet Committee, Canada-US Cabinet Committee. Tomorrow morning, we will convene First Ministers of the provinces and territories, and we will have more to say after we have taken those soundings. And we'll be back to you shortly. Je vais prononcer quelques mots. So, President Trump has just announced a series of measures that are going to fundamentally change the international trading system. Now, in doing so, he has preserved a number of important elements of our relationship, the commercial relationship between Canada and the United States. But the fentanyl tariffs still remain in place, as do the tariffs for steel and aluminum. As of this evening, the tariffs on automobiles will enter into force, and the U.S. has signaled that there will be additional tariffs in so-called strategic sectors, pharmaceuticals, lumber, and semiconductors. So we're in a situation where there is going to be an impact on the U.S. economy, which will build with time. In our judgment, it will be negative on the U.S. economy. That will have an impact on us. But the series of measures will directly affect millions of Canadians. We are going to fight these tariffs with countermeasures. We are going to protect our workers, and we are going to build the strongest economy in the G7. In a crisis, it's important to come together, and it's essential to act with purpose and with force. And that's what we will do. Alors, en français, si je peux.
Okay.
Stop researching with ChatGPT. Its information is not reliable.
In the last few minutes, US President Donald Trump has announced sweeping tariffs on goods imported into the United States from all countries, including the UK. British-made products will face tariffs of 10% from this Saturday. 10% is the baseline tariff applying to all countries in the world. There will, though, be higher, more punitive tariffs on about 60 other countries, which Mr. Trump sees as the worst offenders when it comes to trade imbalances with the United States. For example, 34% tariffs on goods from China. Well, the president also confirmed a 25% tariff on foreign-made cars effective from midnight US time. He said that together, all these tariffs will raise hundreds of billions of dollars a year for the United States, making, in his words, America wealthy again. Well, the president has been speaking in the Rose Garden of the White House on what he's billed as America's Liberation Day, though for many around the world there are now fears of a global trade war, economic slowdown and recession. Well, tonight we'll have analysis and reaction from around the UK and across the world throughout the programme. We'll be hearing from our economics editor, Faisal Islam, and also from our political editor, Chris Mason, on how the UK government will react to these 10% tariffs on British goods. But first, let's go to Sarah Smith at the White House. And Sarah, Donald Trump saying this is one of the most important days in US history.
Yes, he says that economic moves like this haven't been done since the Second World War, and that he is declaring economic independence for the United States. So as you said, there will be tariffs ranging from 10% all the way up to 50% being charged on different countries to export their goods into the United States. And Donald Trump explained that he has set these tariffs depending on how other countries treat US exports. Have a listen to what he had to say.
In a few moments, I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world. Reciprocal, that means they do it to us and we do it to them. Very simple, can't get any simpler than that.
Now, by reciprocal, we should explain what that means, because it's not just a direct tariff for tariff. What's happened is that the White House have calculated all the different ways in which they see trade barriers. So that could be straight tariffs. It could be other non-tariff barriers, like, for instance, technical restrictions, maybe a ban on imports of something like genetically modified corn or hormone-injected beef, that sort of thing. If you need a license to import goods from America, that also counts. They talk about currency manipulation and even the theft of intellectual property. So there are lots and lots of ways in which they have come up with some kind of sum that they say represents the totality of the tariffs that American goods are faced when they are being exported into China or Cambodia or the EU or the UK, for instance. They've come up with a number which, for instance, in Cambodia's case is 97% is what they say the tariff on American goods going there is. So they're halving that and charging 49%. With the EU, they say that they had added up all of the different restrictions they see between trade between the US and the EU. They brought that to 39%, and that's why there's a 20% tariff going on. But other countries that don't fall under this heading, a blanket 10% tariff is being put on all other goods, and that's where the UK falls.
OK, Sarah, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. So as we've been hearing, the UK is facing 10% tariffs on the goods it exports to the US. Well, earlier today, the Chancellor Rachel Reeves indicated the UK government will not rush to retaliate against new American tariffs. And in the Commons, the Prime Minister said Britain will take a calm, pragmatic approach and continue talks with the US about a wider trade deal. Let's get the latest from our political editor, Chris Mason. Chris, what do you think the British government's going to do about this?
Well, it was an extraordinary spectacle, wasn't it, Ben? There you had the president brandishing that rectangular tariff piece of cardboard in front of the world's press and cameras, as if offering the odds at a horse race. And the striking thing is that people in government here were absorbing that live on the television, just as people were around the world. There is a sombre tone from people I speak to in government here tonight, because their view is that any tariff is something they would rather not have. But they are relieved that the 10% tariff is at the lower end of expectations, both in terms of international comparison and, crucially, compared with how high they feared it might be. And actually, in just the last 30 seconds or so, we have had a statement from the Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds. It runs to several paragraphs. I'll bring you the thrust of it. It is the first time I'm seeing it as I read it to you. He says that we'll always act in the best interests of UK businesses and consumers. He points out that in the last few weeks there has been negotiations ongoing about a limited trade deal between the US and the UK, with the hope that that might bring these tariffs down or indeed eradicate them. He says we have a range of tools at our disposal. We will not hesitate to act. We will continue to engage with UK businesses, including on their assessment of the impact of further steps. Nobody wants a trade war, he says. Our intention remains to secure a deal, but nothing is off the table. The government will do everything necessary to defend the UK national interest. So they're attempting to maintain, Ben, a sober and, as they would see it, a proportionate response to what we're seeing from Washington, and a desire to keep negotiating this hoped for trade deal, but holding on to the potential to ratchet things up were that to prove necessary.
OK, Chris, thank you very much indeed. And we can also talk to our economics editor, Faisal Islam, who's with me in the studio. Faisal, these tariffs are clearly going to have a huge impact on the British economy, also the global economy. What's your assessment of where we are tonight?
When you step back, I think you have to give the context to this, which is an extraordinary move, actually. Even if we may have expected larger numbers in some regards, hundreds of billions of dollars per year is what they say it should raise. 6 trillion over a decade was the figure that Donald Trump used. They confirmed the 25% car tariffs coming into force tonight, no exclusions for the UK. And at base, although we heard a lot about reciprocal tariffs, so, you know, tit for tat, quid pro quo, based on what is done to America right now, at base there's a 10% universal tariff for everybody. So it may be a relief that the UK is at that lower ebb, but that still means 6 billion on that. Maybe if you include the cars, 7 billion of extra costs. But the point of this, we hear, is to divert trade flows. I think we can see the document that was held up by President Trump there, and you see a whole sort of list, and in the blue there you see what America thinks is being done to it, and it isn't just the tariff, as Sarah was saying, it's currency manipulation and other trade barriers, and President Trump says he's being kind by only sort of replying with half of that. But there are some huge numbers there, including some rather poor countries, some crisis countries like Myanmar and Laos and Bangladesh. They're on 37%, China on 34%. Well, that's huge. European Union on 20% when the UK is on 10%. Well, that's a net benefit, you might argue, for the UK, but also it could create some distortions to trade. The bottom line is this: the model of trade in the world will shift hugely. That is the point of this change, but it could cause, Taiwan, a key ally of the US, also tariffed hugely. So this could change the geography of economics for good, and it's designed to do so, and that will not be without some disruption.
OK, Faisal, thank you very much indeed. Faisal Islam, our
I need to get that chart somehow, but I feel like, I don't know. I just feel like with the Taiwan tariffs, what is Google or Microsoft or Apple, hyperscalers, NVIDIA, what are these guys going to do? I feel like they are pretty involved in the Trump administration. I could be wrong. And I guess Scott Bessent did say it was a Mag 7 problem, not a MAGA problem. I'd imagine Intel, I am an Intel stockholder, just as a disclaimer, but I do think Intel is poised to benefit from this. If they do produce from... The problem is, though, they produce, I believe they're Intel 3 chips in Ireland, not in the US. So that could be a problem. Customers on Intel 8 though, 18A, definitely will be, I think this is definitely a catalyst to get them on 18A. Yeah. minimis. Okay, I believe, so I was just reading through this, and I'm going to be honest, I was thinking about something else that kind of went over my head. Chinese shippers exploits February 1st, 2025. Okay, so I see it's 801, and this is actually, I think, worth reading. So interesting history lessons on tariffs, trade. So So I need to look into this. But I do have an exam to study for, and my stock portfolio is not going to do so great tomorrow, but we'll have to see what happens. So thanks for tuning in, and definitely catch you guys in the next one. Peace.